Certainly, here's an expanded version of Part I, taking it to around 900 words and deepening the suspenseful, eerie tone you asked for. This section immerses the reader in the aftermath of the crucifixion, as Mary enters a psychological and spiritual night, one of grief, dread, and existential horror. Part I's expanded. The shadows silence. The sun had not set yet, but the sky had turned black, a darkness not of clouds, nor of storm, but of something far older, an ancient night that spilled across the heavens, as though morning had become a living thing. The wind had died. The crowd at Golgotha had dispersed, their cries fading into the echo of hammers, and the faint groaning of wood. Blood still darkened the soil where the cross stood. Mary remained. She stood frozen, her face uplifted to the broken form that hung above her, the one who had once clung to her breast, now lifeless, his ribs bare, his head slumped in the cruel nest of thorns. Her fingers clutched the shawl around her shoulders, as if hiding from the nakedness of death, but nothing could shield her. There was no mother in the world more alone, as the Roman soldiers barked orders, and the body was prepared for burial. Mary heard nothing. A ringing filled her ears, not sound but silence, a hollowness born in the depths of grief. Every movement seemed far away, like a dream slipping into nightmare. Her son had spoken of death often, but nothing could prepare her for its stench. When the centurion's spear thrust into his side, something within her tore. Blood and water poured from the wound, and it was as if the earth had sighed. Mary staggered. The cross loomed over her now, not a symbol of salvation, but a stake driven into the heart of the world. She wanted to scream, to cry out at the injustice, to call on heaven to explain itself, but her lips would not move. The words choked, and she stood in silence. The others, John, Mary Magdalene, Salome, stood nearby, their faces etched with fear. They waited as Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, hurried by the setting sun and the Sabbath's approach, took Jesus' body from the cross. Mary watched them swaddle him in linen, watched as the blood seeped through the cloth, staining it with a final indignity. Her soul recoiled. Even in death, they handled him like a criminal. She wanted to hold him, to cradle his broken frame as she had once done when he was a child, but they took him away too quickly. She followed, not as a mother, but as a mourner trailing behind a ghost. Her sandals brushed dust and gravel along the path, the thud of her feet swallowed by the silence of the crowd that had dispersed in shame and awe. No one met her eyes, no one offered comfort. All that remained was the path to the tomb, a narrow road winding between rocky hills, the sky above dimming into a deeper black. It was then that she noticed the change in the wind. There wasn't any. The air had grown still, unnaturally so. The trees no longer moved. The branches of olive trees hung limp. Not even insects dared to sing. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. A strange heaviness settled in her chest. It was more than sorrow. It was the terrible realization that death had arrived not just for her son, but for something greater. Hope. The future. All of it lay in that linen, wrapped body. The tomb itself was freshly cut, cold, unfeeling, mouth agape like a predator's jaw waiting to devour. Mary stood at its edge as they lowered the body inside. The air from the tomb drifted up and wrapped around her like a shroud. It smelled of damp stone and the absence of life. No one spoke. They rolled the stone across the entrance with solemn precision. It thudded into place, and the finality of that sound rang in her bones. There was something unnatural in that moment, not just the end of her son's life, but the beginning of something sinister. As dusk fell, and they turned to leave, Mary hesitated. She glanced back at the sealed tomb, its presence like a tumor in the landscape. She felt the eyes of something unseen watching from the shadows, something not of man or beast. Her skin prickled. That night, as she walked the road back to Jerusalem with the others, her soul drifted through a twilight world. The streets were nearly empty. Lamps in windows burned low, their flickering flames feeble against the gloom. Every alley whispered. Every doorway seemed a mouth waiting to speak dreadful truths. And in the silence, her thoughts wandered into forbidden places. She had believed in the angel once. She had sung songs of joy. When the child was in her womb, she had heard Simeon in the temple, warning her that a sword would pierce her soul. And now it had. But in that darkness, what good were promises? The dead do not rise. She had seen him breathe his last. She had watched his skin pale, his hands stiffen, and now he lay in a tomb, flesh cold, waiting for decay, the same decay that claims all things, even her. What if death was not defeated? What if all of it, every miracle, every prophecy, was a beautiful lie? That night, sleep did not come. She lay awake in a borrowed room, her back to the wall, her ears alert, every creak of the floorboards above, every gust of wind outside, became a reminder death had entered her world, and it had not left. In the hours before dawn, she rose and pressed her hand to the wall. Her fingers trembled. The night air pressed in. She whispered, "My son, where are you now?" There was no reply, only the darkness. And in the darkness, the first seed of terror bloomed. The Sabbath passed, not as a day of rest, but as a long descent into dread. Mary sat motionless for hours in the corner of the stone room, her shawl drawn over her head. As the world outside moved like a ghost through its routines, she did not eat. She did not sleep, even when others whispered prayers or touched her hand gently. She did not answer. The silence that had followed her from Golgotha now lived within her, a companion too familiar to resist and too cold to comfort. She kept thinking of the tomb. It called to her, not with voice or vision, but with weight. The place where her son's body had been laid, hastily, under the pressure of Roman spears and Sabbath laws, was now a sealed prison of flesh and memory. There had been no time to anoint him, no proper rites, no dignity. The thought clawed at her. The fear that he now lay alone, unattended, swaddled in silence, and surrounded by creeping death. It was unbearable. Before dawn, in that half reality between night and day, she rose from her crouch, clutching the jar of ointments and spices. Magdalene was already waiting. So were Joanna and Salome. Their faces were pale in the lamplight, eyes dark, ringed, lips pressed thin with unshed sobs. No one spoke as they gathered their things. There was no need. Grief had spoken enough. Together they slipped from the house like wraiths, veiled and cloaked, hands trembling around clay jars. The streets of Jerusalem lay asleep, or pretending to be. Only the brave or the desperate walked before sunrise. Mary knew they were both. Every step toward the tomb was like walking deeper into the unknown, into a threshold between the living and the dead. The city's silence was not peaceful. It was thick, stifling. Every creaking shutter, every rustle in the dark, sent tremors up their spines. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then went silent. The scent of night, blooming herbs mixed with the faint odor of rot and dust. It was the smell of death refusing to leave. Mary's thoughts circled in fevered fragments. What if someone had disturbed the body? What if the soldiers had returned to defile the tomb? What if animals? She pushed the thought away with a shudder, clutching the ointment tighter. No, they had to go, no matter what waited for them. As the tomb came into view, a hollow in the rock, still and ancient. The women slow. The sun had barely begun to scrape the edge of the horizon, casting long, violet shadows over the ground. But something was wrong. The stone was moved. It was not cracked, not chipped, not damaged by weather or thieves. It had been rolled away, clean, intentional. Mary felt the air change around her, as though the world had inhaled sharply and refused to exhale. The others gasped. Magdalene took a half step forward, then stopped, trembling. No one spoke. Their feet remained planted in fear. The silence of the tomb yawned before them, an opening that should have been sealed, an invitation that should not exist. Something had happened, something unnatural. Mary hesitated at the edge. Her skin prickled. The wind, gentle and cool, suddenly felt wrong. Too still, too focused, as if it came from within the tomb itself. She stepped forward, her body heavy, her heart hammering with each movement. Peering into the darkness, she saw linen, folded, undisturbed, empty. A scream caught in her throat and died there. The place where his body had lain was vacant. Only silence remained, oppressive and alive, as though the walls themselves breathed sorrow. She stepped back, almost losing her balance. The weight of confusion and terror crushed her. Magdalene cried out, staggering forward, "They have taken the Lord," she gasped. "And we do not know where they have laid him." Mary could not respond. Her mind raced. Who would steal a corpse? Why desecrate a tomb? But beneath those frantic questions, a deeper terror began to coil. What if this was not the work of men? Then she saw them. Two figures seated within the tomb, one where his head had lain, one at his feet. They were clothed in white that glowed dimly in the murk. Their faces were unreadable, neither cruel nor kind, but still alien. Their presence twisted the air, made time feel strange. They asked, "Why do you weep?" Mary's mouth opened. No sound came. The words resounded in her skull, echoing louder than they should have. Were these angels, spirits? Had she gone mad? I do not know where he is," she stammered, backing away. As she turned, her breath caught. A man stood in the early light, just beyond the edge of shadow. Not a soldier, not a disciple, a stranger. His clothes were ordinary. Dust clung to his head. He looked like a gardener, but there was something in his stillness, something not right. He stood as if waiting, not for them, but for her. "Woman," he said, "why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?" His voice was low, familiar. Mary's chest tightened. She stepped forward cautiously, suspicion mixed with aching hope. "Sir, if you have taken him, tell me where he is. I will take him away." The man's eyes met hers, and tears flowed. "Mary," he said, one word. But it was not just speech. It was revelation. That voice carried every memory, every breath, every heartbeat of the boy she once cradled, the man she once mourned. She fell forward, sobbing, grasping at the air between them. "Rabboni," she cried. "Teacher, Savior, Son." But he did not let her touch him. "Do not cling to me," he said. "I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go and tell my brothers what you have seen." The moment shattered. The man, no, more than man, was gone. The tomb behind her was darker now. The world tilted. Mary stood trembling. The others watched her, stunned. Had she seen a ghost, a spirit, or had she stared death in the eye and seen life staring back? She turned away, heart racing, limbs numb, and walked back through the city, through winding streets, where light had not yet fully returned. The stone walls seemed closer now. The shadows darker, more known. The dawn was breaking. Fear still walked beside her. What do you do after seeing death undone? How do you carry a message from the other side of the grave? As she crossed back into Jerusalem, the same fear whispered in her ears. Something has changed. Death is no longer what it was, but something darker may have awakened too. She should have been overjoyed, but as Mary fled from the tomb in the early half-light, her heart raced not only with wonder, but with terror, even spoken by a voice she had heard all her life, a voice that once cried in her arms as a baby, that preached to the multitudes, that gasped in agony from the cross. But it had come from lips that should have been still in death. The world had twisted. Something had happened that no heart could prepare for. Something far beyond miracles. Something that unraveled the veil between what is seen and unseen. She had stood at the edge of a tomb and heard the dead speak. And now, every step she took away from that place felt like walking between two worlds. Behind her, the open tomb still gaped like a wound in the earth. In front of her, Jerusalem remained asleep, ignorant, unchanged. But to Mary, nothing was the same. The stones under her feet, the air in her lungs, the sunlight creeping over rooftops, it all felt different, not brighter, not warmer, but thinner, as if the barrier between the living and the dead had weakened, and death now watched them both from the same side. She passed by empty stalls, past doorways where oil lamps flickered low. The city had not yet stirred, but in her heart, something screamed, they must know, they must be told. And yet, she was afraid. What would she even say? That she had spoken with a man who had died, that the tomb was empty and angels had appeared, that the world's most terrifying truth was not that Jesus was gone, but that he had returned. Her hands trembled violently. She clutched her cloak tightly around her shoulders, though the morning was warm. Every sound startled her. A bird taking flight, a shutter opening, a child crying out in sleep. Her senses were heightened, as if death might still be stalking her, as if the presence she had seen in the tomb still walked behind her, unseen but ever near. But it wasn't fear for her safety. It was fear of the truth, because resurrection was not clean. It was not soft light and harp soul. It was not the comforting tale the old prophets used to soothe weary minds. It was raw, shocking, a rift in reality itself. She had seen his wounds, still open, still red, and yet he stood. He had looked at her with eyes that burned, not with rage, but with a knowing that chilled her, as if he had passed through something no one else had survived, and returned with secrets that could not be spoken. When he said her name, Mary, it wasn't just a greeting. It was a summons. She wasn't sure if she had obeyed it, or if it had consumed her. The others had looked to her for answers when she returned, Magdalene, Joanna, even Peter when he arrived later. But she had none to give. She told them what she had seen, what she had heard. She told them the tomb was empty, and that he was no longer among the dead. And then she fell silent. That evening, the room was filled with fear, not wonder, not praise, but fear. Doors bolted, windows shuttered, voices hushed. Every creak of wood, every passing footstep outside, turned their blood to ice. Not because of the Romans, not because of the temple guards, but because they didn't understand what had come back from that tomb. Mary sat in the corner again, wrapped in her shawl, rocking slightly. She barely responded when someone touched her shoulder or offered her food. Her eyes stared ahead, unfocused, haunted. She could still feel him saying her name, Mary, not loud, not soft, not even mournful, but final, as though it were the last time she would ever hear her name and understand it. That voice echoed in her even now. hours later. It had not come just from the lips of a man. It had come from somewhere deep, from the space between time and eternity, from the void death had opened, and he had walked through unburned. She began to ask herself dark questions. If he had returned, what else might return? If the veil had been lifted once, even just enough for him to step through, what else had slipped through behind him? No one talks about the silence of the grave, how long it must have stretched for him. Where was he in those hours? Where had his soul gone before he reappeared? Mary, more than any of the others, knew something was unfinished. There was no relief in resurrection, no ending, only a pause. The war had shifted, not ended. The powers that killed him still ruled outside their door. Death had not vanished. It had recoiled, and it was watching. Sometimes, when the others dozed or prayed, she would slip to the window and look outside, into alleys, into the corners between buildings, and she swore she saw a shadow move, where there was no wind, no light, no life. It vanished before she could speak of it. But she felt it. She began to dream again, not peaceful dreams, but fractured ones, of walking empty tombs, of her son, no longer bloodied, but crowned with fire, his eyes endless, of voices calling her name from deep below the earth, and of something else, something vast, the kind of dreams that don't fade at sunrise, the kind that follow you even when you're awake, the kind that whisper, you are not done with death. They waited, not for hours, but for days, each one blurred into the next, breathless, quiet, sleepless, as if time itself had paused in fear. Within the upper room, where the disciples hid behind bolted doors, death no longer felt like something that had passed. It lingered, as if unwilling to release its grip, pressing its cold fingers through the stone walls and across their skin. Mary sat in the corner, as she always did, still, hooked, unreadable. She was no longer a woman of words or songs. The mother who once sang praises, when carrying her son, had become a watchful mourner, eyes hollow, listening for sounds the others could not hear. She barely spoke. When she did, her voice was thin and distant, like something echoing from inside a tomb. She did not speak of joy. She did not rejoice. And the others, sensing this, didn't ask why. They feared her silence more than they feared Roman blades, because Mary had seen something they had not. Not just the empty tomb, not just angels, but him. Alive, yes, but not as he was. She had looked into his eyes and seen eternity staring back. It had undone her. There was no word for what she had encountered, no human shape for that kind of return. The world had shifted, and she had been caught in the fracture. So she waited, as all the others did. But her waiting was not for comfort or answers. She was waiting for what would come next. And in the meantime, she began to feel it again, the presence. At first, it came at night, when the room had gone still, and the candles burned low, when most had drifted into fitful sleep. She remained awake. She stared into the corners, into the gaps between wall and shadow. The air would grow colder, heavier. Sometimes it felt like someone was standing over her, just behind her shoulder, breathing, waiting. One night she whispered, "Is it you?" There was no answer, only the silence. She was not sure which answer terrified her more, that it was him, or that it wasn't. She began walking the city again, not openly, and not by day. She cloaked herself, kept to alleys, and moved through Jerusalem, as though chasing a memory. Her feet knew the path, before her mind did, to the mount, to the garden, to the place where the tomb still sat, sealed now, guarded by silence rather than stone. She would stand for hours, staring at it, not to see if it would open again, but to see if anything else might come out. The grave was empty. She had seen it. But in her heart, it was not finished. Resurrection had torn a hole through the veil, and she feared what else might have passed through behind it. When she returned to the upper room, her cloak would smell of night air and damp stone. She'd say nothing. No one dared question her. They were all haunted now. Peter had seen the empty tomb and the risen Lord, but he still trembled in the dark. Thomas would not believe until he touched the wounds himself, and even then, he was pale as death for days. John, the beloved, spoke gently, but wandered the streets as if looking for something he could not name. They had all witnessed the impossible. But Mary had tasted something they hadn't, something deeper, something closer to death than even death itself. At night, her dreams returned, the same ones, over and over. She walked through an empty graveyard. The tombs are open, not broken, just open, as if politely unsealed. There are no bodies, no bones, just the smell of stone and the whisper of wind. And then she hears the footsteps. Slow, steady. She turns, and at first she sees nothing. But then, in the corner of her vision, there is someone watching her from afar. Not her son. Something older, something that does not blink. It says nothing. It waits. She wakes drenched in sweat, her breath shallow. The whisper still echoing in her ears. Not yet. She tried to pray. She truly did. But her prayers came out hollow. She felt no comfort in them, only obligation. There was a part of her, deep within, that wondered if heaven had changed, if the throne of God looked different now, if the resurrection had rearranged the universe itself. And beneath that question, darker thoughts lurked. What if death wasn't defeated, but merely awakened? What if her son had not come back through death, but with it? She never voiced these fears, but they lived in her eyes. The same eyes that had once looked upon the angel Gabriel now stared at walls and saw visions of cracks forming in reality. Even the way the others looked at her began to shift. They treated her with reverence, yes. She was the mother of the risen Lord, Theotokos, blessed among women. But they were also afraid of her. They sensed the weight she carried, the fear, the haunted silence that clung to her like a second skin. One evening, Matthew approached her and asked gently, "Do you believe he's truly alive?" She did not answer immediately. Then she turned, slowly, and said, "I saw him. I heard him say my name. But life is not what it used to be." And she walked away. She began to light candles at strange hours. She would place them in corners, beside the door, near the window. When asked why, she simply said, to keep the dark from settling too deep. But it wasn't ordinary darkness she feared. It was the other kind, the kind that comes not from the absence of light, but from the presence of something waiting, watching, remembering. She no longer feared her own death. That fear had passed. What frightened her now was the idea that death was not an end, but a place her son had gone to and returned from. And if it was a place it had seen her, the day he ascended, the sky looked wrong. It was too clear, too still. The clouds sat unmoving in the upper heavens, like watchers who had seen too much and forgotten how to blink. The breeze was gone. The birds did not sing. The world itself seemed to draw a breath and hold it. Mary stood on the hillside with the others, the disciples, the women, the growing ring of followers who had begun to call him Lord again, this time with trembling reverence. The sun burned behind her, but she felt no warmth. She felt cold, and unnervingly alert. He had led them there. His voice had been calm, his face unscarred, at least to most. But Mary still saw the holes in his hands when he raised them. And it wasn't the marks themselves that troubled her. It was what lay behind them. She had not touched him again since the garden. She had not tried. There had been something in his warning, "Do not cling to me," that went deeper than physical boundaries. It was as if he now existed, only partially in the world they knew. As he lifted his eyes toward heaven, Mary looked away. She did not want to see the moment. She feared what it would do to her. The final unraveling of reality. The man she bore in blood and pain, the one she watched die, ascending beyond earth like a being not of flesh, but of something else. And yet, she could not keep herself from watching. The wind picked up, swirling dust across the hillside. Some gasped. Others cried out. A few fell to their knees, and he rose. No wings, no thunder, just a strange stillness around him, as if the sky itself made room for his passing. His body lifted slowly, eyes fixed on the unseen. And then, the clouds swallowed him. He was gone. Silence followed. No one moved. Mary did not cry. She didn't know how. She had lost him once already, to death, and now, a second time, to glory. But this loss was worse. Death was final, cold, yes, but no. This new departure was something else, like losing a shadow that had always followed you, only to realize it might now be ahead of you, waiting. The others began to speak of power, of spirit, of promises to come. They clung to hope, clung to prophecy, reciting his words like spells against despair. But Mary could not speak. Something inside her had gone hollow. That night, she walked alone. She left the gathering and returned to the old places, the narrow paths, the olive groves, the places where she had once followed him as a boy, where his laughter had echoed among the trees. She wandered until the stars hung low and the wind grew sharp. She spoke aloud only once. "You are not here." It was not a question, not anger, either, just truth. And the trees whispered back, dry rustling branches and leaves moving without wind. The days passed, Jerusalem shifted, news spread. Some believed, some mocked. The temple remained silent, and Rome sharpened its knives. And through it all, Mary stayed in the background, wrapped in layers of power. She became something between saint and ghost. The others honored her, but always with a quiet hesitation. Even John, who took her into his home, treated her like sacred glass, beautiful, but fragile, untouchable, because they knew she had seen too much. Not just the crucifixion, not just the risen Christ, but what he had become. He had not returned as her son. Not exactly. Not fully. He had returned as something else. And she had known, even then, in the garden. The man who said her name was not the same child she once carried. He had passed through death. And death does not let you return unchanged. She began speaking to the dead. Not in madness, not in ritual, just quietly, softly, in the dark hours when the house slept and the shadows crept closer. She would light a single candle and sit in silence, then whisper to the empty space before her. "I saw you. You called me by name." Sometimes she thought she heard breathing. Sometimes she felt warmth or cold. She no longer feared these things. Fear was a luxury for those still untouched. She had been claimed, first by motherhood, then by grief, and then, finally, by that strange calling only resurrection leaves behind. The others scattered, spreading the message, Peter to Rome, Thomas to India, James to Jerusalem. But Mary stayed. In the stillness of old rooms and hollow streets, she waited, not for death. She knew that would come. Not for glory. She had seen enough of that to last lifetimes. arms. She waited for the veil to tear once more. She began having visions, not of angels, not even of her son, but of empty places, endless plains of gray stone, doors without handles, stairs that descended but never rose. She began to see faces in reflections, not hers, not others, faces she couldn't name, watching her through water and glass, always without expression. And in her bones, she felt the truth. Resurrection had not sealed the tomb, it had opened it. And death, once conquered, was now awake, watching, learning. Mary died in quiet, or so the story goes. But those who were there say her last breath came not with peace, but with eyes wide open, staring at something only she could see. Some say she smiled, others say she tried to speak, but no one could hear. And when they laid her body to rest, the room grew colder. The candle went out on its own. The shadows pressed in. And in the days that followed, the disciples began to dream of a voice whispering from deep beneath the earth, calling them by name, one by one,